So, thank you very much, Rainer. There are a number of things that are expected when there is a named lecture. One is that the presenter says a number of good things about the person that's being invited, otherwise it's a bit bad manners. But it's certainly what Rainer did was certainly beyond the call of duty, because I've never heard such a well-documented presentation, well and sort of illustrated in addition, so thank you very much for that. But there are also some things that are expected from the invited lecturer. First thing in that case is really the lecturer has to give the impression that he's prepared the lecture well. And the best evidence usually is that there is a script. Now, personally, I don't like giving lectures from a script. I prefer talking to people on the basis of some scribblings which I myself can hardly read. But today I made the effort, Richard, and I have a script. But then the second thing that is expected from a lecturer, when there is a named lecturer, is that he should at least give the impression that he's heard of the name of the person after whom the lecture is named. Now, in this case, this was pretty easy, and before leaving Brussels, I went in my shelves and I saw there were a few Weber books, oof, and I first picked up Wirtschaft und Gesellschaft. I first felt how much it would weigh in my suitcase, and then I looked at the smallness of the letters, so I put it back. But I found another one that is far better, called Politik als Beruf. I discovered, I bought it, in fact, in Bielefeld, when I was a student in Bielefeld in May 1977, but never read it until I came to Florence, and it was my bedtime reading in the last two weeks. And I read it with great interest. There are a number of classic passages in it. And then finally, in the last paragraph, I found the quote with which I wanted to start today's lecture. And it says this: Es ist ja durchaus richtig und alle geschichtliche Erfahrung bestätigt es. It is absolutely correct, and all historical experience confirms it. What? Dass man das Mögliche nicht erreichte, wenn nicht immer wieder nach dem Unmöglichen gegriffen worden wäre. That one would not achieve the possible if one did not reach again and again for the impossible. This sentence, pronounced in a Munich bookshop in the immediate aftermath of World War I, captures an important conviction at the background on this lecture, and indeed of the time I have left to live. To spell out, illustrate, and radicalize this conviction, let me quote straight away another social thinker of the 20th century who will play an important role at the end of this lecture. Is the one having fun there on the right-hand side of the slide. We are then in the aftermath of World War II, 1949. And Friedrich Hayek is very, very worried. Because it's not only that Europe, significant part of Europe, are becoming socialist from Estonia to Albania, but even in Western Europe, you have nationalizations, you have the beginning of the fast expansion of the welfare states. Even in North America, you have the New Deal. Statism, socialism is winning all over. And he writes in this article, warmly recommended, called The Intellectuals and Socialism. If we are to avoid such a development, what I just mentioned, we must be able to offer a new liberal program which appeals to the imagination. We must make the building of a free society once more an intellectual adventure, a deed of courage. What we lack is a liberal utopia, a true liberal radicalism which does not spare the susceptibilities of the mighty, which is not too severely practical, and which does not confine itself to what appears today as politically possible. The main lesson, these are the last words of this article, the main lesson which the true liberal must learn from the success of the socialists is that it was their courage to be utopian which gained them the support of the intellectuals and thereby an influence of public opinion which is daily making possible what only recently seemed utterly remote. Next month, it will be 500 years since the publication in Louvain of Thomas More's, the first edition of Thomas More's Utopia. But this is not the reason why we should revalue utopian thinking and utopian acting. Articulating our utopias, das Unmögliche, is not just a way of enabling us to achieve what is possible, as mentioned and as asserted by Weber, it is needed to make possible what is currently impossible, as Hayek put it. Had Hayek not thought so and been right in thinking so, his neoliberalism would not be dominating the world half a century later. If we don't want to remain stuck forever with neoliberalism or to leave the field at the mercy of populist or jihadist utopias, what we need now is learn from Hayek what he said he learned from the socialists. We need bold utopias, not least for us Europeans, as regards the destiny of the European Union. A bold utopia, yes, but not any old utopia. And the first question to ask when engaging in utopian thinking, or at least a question one should not wait too long before addressing, is the question of the goal that is being pursued, the ultimate standard by which the utopia will need to be guided, justified, and judged. My answer to this question is simple, and it is in fact the same as the answer which Condorcet gave in the middle of the discussion about another utopia, the abolition of slavery. It's the same as the answer Condorcet gave to three questions he asked himself. Quelle est la première règle de la politique, he asked. C'est d'être juste. La seconde, c'est d'être juste. Et la troisième, c'est encore d'être juste. I shall ask you to simply accept this answer for the duration of my talk, but not necessarily the answer that I'm going to offer to another question that follows immediately. What would a just Europe look like? What does justice mean when applied to that weird political entity now called the European Union, which is neither a nation or a state, nor mankind as a whole? The succession of so-called crises in the European Union has been going through in the last decade: financial crisis, euro crisis, refugee crisis, Brexit, and many more, has unsurprisingly triggered a vivid discussion about the very nature and purpose of the European Union. This is by no means the first time this happens in the history of the European institutions, but in the most recent discussion between political leaders, in the general public, and among academics, the issue of justice has been more salient than ever before. Justice between member states, justice between European citizens, and justice towards third-party nationals. But what does justice demand in this context? To answer this question, I can find no better point of departure than what John Rawls had to say on the subject. I turn to the gentleman here below on the left in a picture which you've only seen in one other place, which is on the cover of the book that was shown, and it's a picture of John Rawls at the time he was writing The Theory of Justice. And I'm going to contrast that John Rawls later on in my talk to the John Rawls of the Law of Peoples, which will be, in a way, the main target of today's evening. So John Rawls, for those less familiar to this field, is an American philosopher who is rightly, I think, regarded as the founding father of contemporary political philosophy. His 1971 book, called The Theory of Justice, proposed a novel, tightly argued, liberal egalitarian theory of justice, that is, a theory whose basic premise is that the institutions of a society must be justifiable to its members, considered as free and equal citizens. More precisely, but still roughly, the principles proposed by Rawls, the principles in which his theory of justice for a particular country consisting, amount to requiring three things. One, the protection of a number of fundamental liberties. Two, the equalization of opportunities with given talents. And three, the abolition of all social and economic inequalities that do not contribute to improving the expectations of the worst off. Inequalities are only justified if they contribute to improving the fate or the expected fate of the worst off. The theory is, for Rawls, meant to apply to individual societies. But what about the world as a whole? What about global justice? As globalization amplified, the question could not be eluded. And in an Amnesty International lecture, which Rawls gave in Oxford in 1993, before a massive audience, Rawls, then aged 72, sketched under the title The Law of Peoples what he saw as the most consistent global extension of his approach to domestic justice. I attended that lecture, and I was not the only one to be deeply disappointed by the modesty of what he regarded as the demands of worldwide economic justice. In the following years, fighting against the declining health, Rawls endeavored to spell out this conception of international justice in a little book with the same title, a draft of which he sent to me, and I went to discuss with him at his home in Lexington in April 1998. 1 week later, 1 week after our long discussion, I sent him a written formulation of the central objections I had put to him. In particular, I wanted to spell out more fully why, as a citizen of Belgium and of the European Union, the approach he proposed in the Law of Peoples both perplexed me and disturbed me. The following month, Rawls replied, "Now, after some time, I'm back trying to complete the Law of Peoples and hope the end is in sight. However, I wouldn't feel comfortable about the Law of Peoples until I can formulate a reasonable reply to your long letter to me." Rawls' own long reply, and then followed, contains his only explicit discussion of the European Union, and at the same time a stern warning to Europeans, which the Brexit vote and the Trump vote have made, if anything, more relevant than ever. I had, and I have, great admiration, indeed affection, for John Rawls, both as a philosopher and as a human being, but I strongly disagree with him on this subject. And this is what I want to share with you this evening. In fact, the menu for this evening will be structured around the three main disagreements I have with him and that were expressed in this correspondence. This is the menu for tonight. We've already had the antipasti with Weber and Condorcet. There will be three main dishes and then a small dessert, hopefully digestible enough. First then, let me turn to what I'm going to call Rawls's populism and my reason for disagreeing with it. Rawls' Law of Peoples presents and defends a profoundly dualist conception of justice. Justice between peoples is fundamentally different from justice within one people. The principles that define justice within a people, I briefly presented them earlier. They can be understood as, and I present them earlier, fundamental liberties, equal opportunity, and maximin, and so maximization of the expectation of the worst off. These are presented by Rawls as being chosen in an imaginary original position behind a veil of ignorance, by representatives of individual members of the people concerned, who are supposed to pursue their personal interest without knowing their personal features or their specific conception of the good. And this is a sort of device, counterfactual device, that helps to capture the notion of fairness, of impartiality between people's interests and between their conceptions of the good life. By contrast, the principles that define justice between people should be understood as being chosen in a different original positions by representatives of peoples, of countries, who are supposed to pursue the realization of their people's conception of a good society without knowing, again, their specific features or the specific contours of their conception of a good society. This is what Rawls saw as the most consistent extension to the world of the liberal approach he developed for a particular society. Just as the characterization of a just society should not rest on a particular conception of the good life, the characterization of a just world should not rest on a particular conception of the good society, or be a liberal one. That would be a form of imperialism in his view. But what does a population need? That's a crucial question for the application to the European Union. What does a population need to form a people in Rawls's sense? It must be, I quote Rawls's formula, united by common sympathies and a desire to be under the same democratic government. Somewhat more explicitly, he quotes in that letter, and then also later in the published version of The Law of Peoples, he quotes the famous passage in the beginning, in fact, of chapter 16 of John Stuart Mill's Considerations on the Representative Government, which spells out, which uses also the phrase common sympathies, and then phrases what is for him nationality. So that's the way, and there is not much more by way of explicit definition in Rawls of what a people is, but he refers to this definition by Mill. Because of the fundamental role Rawls thereby gives to the peoples or the nations that form the human population of our planet, I shall call his approach populist. As a citizen of the Belgian federal state and of the European Union, this aspect of his approach could not help perplexing me, what I announced previously. Rawls's own people was unproblematically the American nation, not the people of Massachusetts or of NAFTA. But what is my people? What should I regard as my people, mon peuple, mein Volk? Free movement, non-discrimination, and the growing salience of decisions taken at EU level on the one hand, and the devolution of major competences to Belgium's regional governments on the other, combine to make the relationship that obtains between the Flemish and the Walloon citizens of Belgium less and less different from the one that obtains between the citizen of the Netherlands and the citizen of France. Giving to these peoples, essentially today's nation-states, an irreducible role in matters of worldwide justice, analogous to the one conferred to citizens in matters of countrywide justice, making them the ultimate atoms or monads of international justice, seemed to me far from self-evident. I tried to express this perplexity when we met in Lexington and then in the letter, and Rawls replied the following. You are critical of my use of the idea of the nation-state, closely linked to this notion of people. But I think you overlook what I say about that idea in paragraph 2 of the draft. There it says that the requirement that the liberal people have a common language, history and culture with a shared historical consciousness is rarely, if ever, fully satisfied. These features appear in Mill's characterization of a people. Perhaps if we begin with this standard case, we can work out political principles that will in due course enable us to deal with more difficult cases. In any event, a simple presentation using only liberal peoples as nations in this strict sense is not to be summarily dismissed. In a matter so complex as the law of peoples, we must start with fairly simple models and see how far we can make them go. To this I responded at the time, and I would still respond today. My challenge, and for me it's really an important point, my challenge is not about the methodological priority of simpler cases, but about the substantive importance of the question of where the borders between peoples should be drawn. There may be some countries and episodes in history in which the location and meaning of borders are so intangible that they are tantamount to facts of nature. But there are many other countries and periods in which either the location of these borders, think of Scotland, Catalonia, Flanders, or their meaning, Brexit, Grexit, or both are under challenge or negotiations, at least as much as most of the domestic political and socio-economic institutions. And then it seems to me that we are entitled to expect from political philosophers something more specific about what the borders should be and what they should mean. Then the peoples must decide democratically. Just as political philosophers are expected to say something more specific than this about the just pattern of political and socio-economic institutions domestically. So I'm not saying that the majority, I'm still quoting from my response to Rawls, I'm not saying that the majority of complex cases should be treated before or on a par with the minority of simpler cases, rather than they should alert us to a practically important and logically prior question, which is which populations should be regarded as or turned into peoples or become more or less people-like than they are. Of course, they will and should decide themselves, but just as in the case of political and socio-economic institutions, is it not part of our role as political philosophers to guide their decisions? Or I would put it in a different way also today, which is these common sympathies, no matter what their source may be, Rawls's expression, which are the defining feature of a people, should not be taken as parameters which help determine what the demands of justice are. They should rather be regarded as being malleable, liable to being deeply affected by institutions, and hence as something that collective action can help create, strengthen, reshape, and undermine for the sake of greater justice. Now, this sharp dichotomy, sort of dualism between two types of conceptions of justice, one within a country, domestic, and one between countries, is in Rawls's case dependent on this sort of personification of the peoples. His friend and colleague Thomas Nagel, in a famous article, very interesting article published in 2005, tried to defend the dualistic position that is not dependent on that personification of the peoples. His own view is that what makes egalitarian justice, the demands of egalitarian justice kick in, is not the existence of a people, these common sympathies, but the existing of a democratic state, of a population consisting of people who are both the subjects and the co-authors of coercive laws. He discusses explicitly the European Union and has doubts about whether the European Union is state-like enough and is democratic enough to qualify as satisfying these conditions, but he doesn't exclude it, and he said at some point in the future this may happen. Now, after 2005, we had a number of things like the Lisbon Treaty, the Greek crisis, where the strength of the coercive laws were being felt perhaps more vividly than ever before, and the question is open then whether, if you take Nagel's view, something like egalitarian justice between the individual citizens of the European Union is the way in which we should think about justice within the European Union. But for the sake of time, I don't go into that discussion, and I present very quickly and elliptically, essentially with an anecdote, my own view. My own view is closer to Nagel's than to Rawls, but it's far more radical than either, because the conditions I consider necessary and sufficient for the demands of egalitarian justice to kick in can be viewed as very weak versions, and therefore far more general, of Nagel's two conditions, state and democracy. This is not the place to spell it out, but let me just convey the intuition as follows, and that's the explanation of the picture underneath in this slide. At the end of 2005, I was invited by my first graduate student, who was a Biafran priest, to his province in Nigeria. And as I was about to leave, I was surrounded by little kids. And one of the little kids, I call him Stanley because about 2 out of 3 kids there seem to be called Stanley. I don't know what his name was. And Stanley said, so when I said, sorry, now I have to go to the airport and go back to Belgium. And Stanley said, I'm coming with you. And then I replied, no, this is not possible because your mom will never let you go. And he said, no, my mom would like me to go because you are going to Belgium. And Belgium there has a special connotation because I think Belgium is a city in Germany from which all the good quality second-hand cars come. So it's a world of plenty, so I'm going to. And so he wanted to come to Belgium, and his mom would certainly be very keen on that. And then I mumbled some. I told him something, but I felt, and then I went back. I said bye-bye, and I felt really bad because I thought this was a fair question by this kid, and I dismissed the question. I replied as a joke, I said, and what made me aware, I've kept thinking about that case many times afterwards, because there are a number of people, so a la Rawls, and many others, in fact, who make this dichotomy between domestic justice and global justice. And people like me would say, when asked this question, why if Stanley asked me, why do you have so much and me so little, there are two sorts of answers which I regard as legitimate, and which would be regarded also legitimate by my fellow liberal egalitarian philosophers. And one legitimate answer is, well, look, we had the same opportunities, and I've just worked harder than you, and that's why I'm so rich and you're so poor. Bullshit, of course, in this case. So that's not valid. It would be a good justification if it was true. It's not. Second possibility, look, if people like me were not as rich as we are, you would be even worse off. That's the different principle, so the third component of Rawls's theory of justice, saying, well, of course it's inequality, it's undeserved, but it's useful for the worst off. And so that bullshit, of course, in this case too. And then some people believe, and that's the other group from which, including Rawls, from which I dissent, that there is a third possible answer to Stanley, if the first two are not valid, which is, Stanley, but you are just a Nigerian. I'm a Belgian, right? And that should be sufficient as a justification. What I'm saying, this is an unacceptable justification. And fundamentally, my intuition about saying, well, the only way today of thinking of social justice is on a global level. But the reason for that, and I'll be brief on, is not that I think that there's something like cosmopolitan justice that is that applies among all human beings, whatever their relationships are, but the fundamental reason is that we have already today at the world level or close, we're in the process of getting two weaker versions of Nagel's conditions. That is, on the one hand, we have something like a coercive global institutional structure, if only in the form of borders. Borders impose massive constraints on the opportunities of people throughout the world that try to cross them and count that, because it makes such a difference. This is, of course, not imposed by one world state, but it's imposed on people and has a massive impact on their life. And it's coercive, could be changed, has to be justified. That's the first aspect. It's not a state, but it's coercive rules. And the second one is that we don't have a democracy, we don't have a democratic forum on a world on a world scale, but we have a conversation across borders of this sort, of the Stanley type, which doesn't pass through negotiations through our diplomats, and that creates something like a justificatory community that's not institutionalized as it is in democracies, but that is sufficient to trigger the demands of egalitarian justice. And this is ultimately my view, but in fact, if people a la Nagel consider that the European Union is sufficiently state-like and sufficiently democratic for egalitarian justice to kick in, his position and my position would lead to the same conclusions in the case of the European Union. Let me turn then to the second disagreement, which is Rawls' stinginess. He didn't like that I called him stingy. All of what I've just said would be no more than philosophical nitpicking if the demands of justice, and in particular of distributive justice, were only marginally affected as a result of shrinking or swelling people and the boundaries of a people. That is, as a result of shifting from justice within a people to justice between peoples, or the other way around. The impact, however, is huge, so at least I thought, and I tried to express in my conversation with Rawls and my subsequent letter. I had tried to explain that the approach proposed in the law of peoples not only perplexed me for the reason indicated, but also disturbed me because the position expressed seemed to provide strong philosophical ammunition both to neoliberal and nationalist opposition to the emergence of a social Europe, that is, of the European institutions getting actively involved in social policy, and to the Flemish nationalist demands in my own country for downsizing or scrapping altogether Belgium's federal welfare state. My initial letter, I contrasted the generous difference principle, and that is the third component of his egalitarian theory, liberal egalitarian theory, so the maximization of the expectations of social and economic advantages associated with the worst social position. I contrasted the generous difference principle, which he applies domestically, with the stingy duty of assistance proposed for inter-people distributive justice in the law of peoples. This duty, which he defends in the law of peoples, duty of assistance to burdened societies, is a duty which just liberal societies have towards societies whose level of development is insufficient for the viability of just institutions. His dualist approach to justice, it seemed to me, implied that only the stingier principles applied to the European Union and arguably to Belgium. Rawls politely responded that I misunderstood him, and in order to help me understand better, he constructed a European illustration. He said, he wrote, "I believe that you interpret the law of peoples differently from me," which is a polite way of saying you didn't get the point, right? Thus, suppose that the two or more of the liberal democratic societies of Europe, say Belgium and the Netherlands, would you listen? Or these two together with France and Germany decide that they want to join and form a single society or single federal union. Assuming they are all liberal societies, any such union must be agreed to by an election, in which in each society the decision whether to unite is thoroughly discussed. And then after that, they'll opt for a particular conception of justice. And he says, here we have Rawls says, here we have a division of labor between the law of peoples, which is to serve as a scheme of norms for international law, and then the decisions of free and equal citizens in liberal societies. I don't feel that this division of labor, correctly understood, is stingy. You write as if what I call later the duty of assistance is relevant to the situation we are discussing. But what Belgium and the Netherlands owe to each other in a union between them cannot be a decision between, say, a difference principle on the one hand and duty of assistance on the other. Perhaps I fail to grasp your meaning. These are two different things. So Rawls agrees that something like the difference principle would apply if the member states chose democratically to form a single society or federal union, while it would not apply, in his view, at the level of the European Union as it is. That's his view as expressed. But he finds my comparison between the difference principle and the duty of assistance irrelevant in this context. To this I replied, although the duty of assistance is not one that currently applies to the Netherlands with respect to Belgium, since the latter cannot currently count as a burdened society, can't it nonetheless be said that the Netherlands have such a duty towards the Belgian population in the event that circumstances led Belgium to be burdened in the appropriate sense. Since the duty of assistance is the only principle of the law of peoples which includes a significant redistributive dimension, and so between peoples there is only this duty that applies, not something far more generous like the difference principle, it then seems to make sense to compare this weak distributive obligation of justice, which is currently not triggered, which holds between the Belgian and Dutch populations if they are viewed as two different people, to the stronger redistributive obligations of justice, which would hold if they formed a single country or federal union. So I think there was really a misunderstanding, I think, on this part rather than on mine in this case. But I would today qualify this in the sense that even if the European Union doesn't form a federal state in a strong sense, in fact, the duty of assistance may have more bite after the 2007 enlargement, after the 2007 enlargement, than it had in 1998 when this correspondence took place. So Bulgaria and Romania have a GDP per capita about 1/4 of the European average, and it could be said there is a real duty of assistance in order to enable those member states to maintain something that can qualify as just liberal institutions. That's one. And two, and most importantly, what I completely neglected in my reply is the room that could be made for cooperative justice. And there is quite a significant recent discussion, in fact, we heard some of it here in the Institute not long ago, about the duties of justice. A number of people who've been trying to tackle the issue of justice within the European Union see it above all as a sort of obligations of cooperative justice between the member states rather than anything like egalitarian justice. But I'll skip all the detail of discussion of all that so that we can move to my final disagreement and a discussion of the most striking passage in Rawls's reply. Taking cooperative justice into account makes the Rawlsian approach to distributive justice in the European Union less stingy than it would be if distributive justice between member states reduced to the duty of assistance to burdened societies. But even if all the problem, tricky conceptual difficulties raised and empirical difficulties raised by the very notion of a fair sharing of the cooperative surplus, even if all that is solved in the best possible way, it would remain very different and far less generous than an egalitarian principle of justice between all the citizens of the European Union. Let me then shift to the third and last disagreement, which concerns Rawls's anti-Americanism, as my short way of putting his position here. So, against the background of all I've said about the first two disagreements, I turn to this last point, which relates directly to the course to be followed by the European Union and appears so in the final paragraphs of Rawls's letter. One question, he there says, the Europeans should ask themselves, if I may hazard a suggestion. He was always a very cautious man, not a bully. So one question the Europeans should ask themselves, if I may hazard a suggestion, is how far-reaching they want their union to be. It seems to me that much would be lost if the European Union became a federal union like the United States. Here, there is a common language of political discourse and a ready willingness to move from one state to another. Isn't there a conflict between a large, free and open market comprising all of Europe and the individual nation states, each with its separate political and social institutions, historical memories and forms and traditions of social policy? Surely, these are great value to the citizens of these countries and give meaning to their life. The large open market, listen to this, the large open market, including all of Europe, is aim of the large banks and the capitalist business class, whose main goal is simply larger profit. The idea of economic growth onwards and upwards with no specific end in sight fits this class perfectly. If I speak about distribution, it is almost always in terms of trickle down. the long-term results of this, which we already have in the United States, is a civil society awash in a meaningless consumerism of some kind. I can't believe that this is what you want. Okay. This vigorous advice to Europeans by a prominent American not to go American has certainly lost none of its relevance following the sequence of crises the European Union has recently gone through, nor following America's most recent presidential election. I replied that this was indeed not what I wanted. However, 2 points. Isn't there something in the following argument held by left-of-center advocates of the so-called common and later single market? I was thinking of Jacques Delors, for example. Getting rid of the inefficiencies stemming from limited scale and local monopolies is a good thing, providing the growth it generates improves the fate of the worst off in our respective countries, of course with the help of mechanisms that need to go far beyond spontaneous market trickle-down. And 2, whether or not the preceding reasoning made sense at an earlier stage, we now have the single European market and soon, at the time, the single European currency. And the transition costs of rolling them back seem high enough to believe them to be irreversible. In this context, is the erection of a genuine European polity that would encompass the European single market not far better than letting each national polity immersed in this market and beyond in an increasingly globalized world market struggle with the latter's constraints? Of course, this would mean transforming the populations of Europe into something like a people, a demos, not an ethnos. But this could and should be compatible with vigorous measures to protect their linguistic and hence cultural diversity, especially through a tough application of the territoriality principle of official language use. Indeed, it would be essential to prevent, and so creating this federal union would be essential to prevent a rapid erosion of their precious cultural differences under the crushing pressure of the obsession with the nation's competitive positions, which would inexorably occur if we had the single market without anything resembling a single people. My suggestion, in other words, is that something more like the United States in terms of political institutions, a stronger federal union, is required to prevent Europe becoming more like the United States in both social and cultural terms. And now I come to the most ominous part of my talk, which will be concerned with Hayeks Trap, who is still there in the corner smiling with some satisfaction at what is happening with us today. This third disagreement I have with Rawls is of the most direct, indeed urgent importance today. In order to best explain its key point, I would like to draw your attention to a very early plea for a European federation to be found in an article published in 1939, this time 10 years before, by Friedrich Hayek under the title The Economic Conditions of Interstate Federalism. I noticed yesterday that Wolfgang Streeck was also making a lot of this text in his book Gekaufte Zeit, but because he hasn't drawn all the conclusions of the 1949 article, which I mentioned at the beginning, his own conclusions are very different from mine. My key point is simply that it is urgent for us to do as soon as possible and before it's too late whatever is needed in order to escape from Hayek's trap as lucidly outlined in that article. For why did Hayek find a multinational federation, such as the European Union, such a good idea? Because of the wonderful combination of two features. The first of these features resides in the economic constraints on state-level policy that stems from the freedom of cross-border movement. That is, this feature is the disabling function of the common market. I quote, for example, if goods, men and money can move freely over the interstate frontiers, it becomes clearly impossible to affect the prices of the different products through action by the individual state. And he explains further, I won't give all the quotes, how this this immersion in the common market will disempower states that won't no longer affect prices, even imposing restrictions on child labor, on working hours will become different. Taxation, both direct and indirect, will be more and more difficult at that level. And not only governments will be disempowered, but also national organizations, trade unions in particular, will lose their monopolistic, I quote, positions and thus quasi-national organizations their power to control the supply of their services or products. All wonderful for Hayek, right? But won't the capacity to act at the national level be replaced by a capacity to act on the newly created level of the federation as a whole? By no means, he says. And this is the second feature which, combined with the first one, accounts for Hayek's enthusiasm. For there are two serious obstacles to the creation of such a capacity. Firstly, there are the economic differences, likely to be far more pronounced in a large entity than in a small one. Many forms of, he said, for example, many forms of state interference, welcome in one stage of economic progress, are regarded in another as a great impediment. Even such legislation as the limitation of working hours or compulsory employment insurance will be viewed in a different light in poor and in rich regions, etc. So that's the first obstacle. Second obstacle is even more serious. First obstacle is the differences in economic situations, objective economic situations in various parts of the federation. Second obstacle, even more serious, a multinational federation lacks the common identity and the associated solidarity that nation-states can bank on. Quote just one passage, but it's worth reading the rest. I strongly advise reading that article. In the national state, current ideologies make it comparatively easy to persuade the rest of the community that it is in their interest to protect their iron industry or their wheat production or whatever it be. The decisive consideration is that their sacrifice benefits compatriots whose position is familiar to them. Will the same motives operate in favor of other members of the Union? Is it likely that the French peasant will be willing to pay more for his fertilizer to help the British chemical industry? Will the clerk in the City of London be ready to pay more for his shoes or his bicycle to help Belgian workmen? The answer for Hayek leaves no doubt. And there are further examples which bring very sort of familiar today. But the outcome of the two features, two features, which is the disabling of national states, the economic unfeasibility of doing all these things at the national level, combined with the political unfeasibility of taking over these functions at the higher level, all this leads to the following. There seems to be little possible doubt that the scope for the regulation of economic life will be much narrower for the central government of a federation than for national states. And since, as we have seen, the power of the states which comprise the federation will be yet more limited, much of the interference with economic life to which we have become accustomed will be altogether impracticable under a federal organization. Consequently, the creation of such a multinational federation is an essential and indeed a fantastic tool, these are my words, for the realization of Hayek's neoliberal utopia. He puts it very bluntly as follows, I quote, "The creation of an effective international order," and by that he meant this multinational federation, the creation of an effective international order of law is a necessary complement and a logical consummation of the liberal program. And now we come to the person in the right-hand side, so very satisfied about what's going on there. If there is one person who got Hayek's message perfectly, it's Margaret Thatcher. She campaigned for her country to confirm its membership in the European Union in 1975. When in power, between 79 and 90, she strongly supported the further unification of the common market, in particular thanks to the 1986 Single European Act. And she also strongly supported the further expansion of its reach, made possible by the 1989 collapse of the Iron Curtain. In accordance with Hayek's argument, the increased mobility created by the deepening of the common market further disempowered the member states, while the increased heterogeneity created by the post-89 enlargements further prevented the federation from taking over from the member states the redistributive powers in particular, but also some regulatory powers which the states were increasingly unable to exercise. This is Hayek's trap, the trap we are in more than ever after the 2004 and 2007 enlargements, and as a result of relentless defense of the four freedoms by the European Commission and the Court of Justice of the European Union. How should we react? My answer remains the one contained in the rhetorical question I asked in my reply to Rawls, quoted earlier, which was in this context, is the erection of a genuine European polity that would encompass the European single market not far better than letting each national polity immersed in this market and beyond in the world market struggle with the constraints of these markets. In particular, we urgently need to build socio-economic institutions that equalize the prospects among all European citizens, not only by opening the internal borders, but even more, or at least as importantly, by organizing at least part of the redistribution on a higher scale. Such redistribution will foster the pursuit of egalitarian justice both directly, through union-level transfers better protected than national redistribution against social and tax competition, but also indirectly by protecting national-level redistribution against such competition. I won't explain more concretely how I think this should be implemented, but what is clear is that the political achievability and sustainability of all this requires a further empowerment of the Union that should be entitled to tax and redistribute across borders less insignificantly than it does now. The European Union does not need to mimic the United States, but it must, in this respect, become more like the United States if it doesn't want to let its European social model degenerate, stuck as it is in Hayek's trap, into something far more pathetic than the American welfare state, which many Europeans look down upon. Such a move needed to get out of the trap is, of course, exactly what Hayek's disciple, Margaret Thatcher, would hate to see happening. In her book, Statecraft, 2002, she formulates a fiery plea against those who want to erect something like the United States of Europe. The parallel with the United States, she says, is both deeply flawed and deeply significant. It is flawed because the United States was based from its inception on a common language, culture, and values. Europe has none of these things. It's also flawed because the United States was forged in the 18th century and transformed into a truly federal system through events, above all through the necessities and outcomes of war. By contrast, Europe is the result of plans. It is in fact a classic utopian project, a monument to the vanity of intellectuals, a program whose inevitable destiny is failure. Only the scale of the final damage done is in doubt. What she says, in a nutshell, is, please, no utopia to get us out of Hayek's utopia. And as the realization spreads that this is what we need, as pressure is mounting to move in this direction, her advice to Britain has become, and would today be, to get out of the grip of this monster. After we want our money back, it must be we want our country back. But all this, of course, while retaining full access to the European market, which the UK and Thatcher itself did so much to help deepen and expand. In this way, if you have this, getting out while keeping full access, in this way, a sovereign Britain can comfortably undermine, through tax and social competition, any serious attempt to pursue egalitarian justice at either national or union level within the European Union. In other words, let's Brexit, but softly, so that our sabotage capacity is not dented. This is what could be called, without too much fantasy, Thatcher's plot, the conspiracy aimed at saving Hayek's neoliberal utopia against the so-called classical utopian project of political, social, fiscal union, whose inevitable destiny, Thatcher said, is failure. Time now to return to the very last bit of Rawls's letter, after the passage I quoted, the very anti-capitalist passage I quoted. As regards objectives, not mean there is no doubt that Rawls and I are on the same side of the barricades, and Hayek and Thatcher on the other. This is how he finishes his letter. So you see, then, after he said, this is clearly not what you want, so you see that I'm not happy about globalization as the banks and business class are pushing it. I accept Mill's idea of the stationary state, as described in this wonderful passage of the Principles of Political Economy, where John Stuart Mill says, 1848, I can't understand all this obsession with growth at all costs, which my fellow economists seem to regard as obvious. So what we need is a stationary state, no growth. And Rawls said, this is my utopia. I'm under no illusion that its time will ever come, certainly not soon, but it is possible, and hence has a place in what I call the idea of realist utopia. I love this. I love this final passage. If this realistic utopia is to win against Hayek, it will have to protect itself against the pressure of globalization, including through tough Brexit negotiations, against tax and social competition by a potential pirate state across the Channel. Above all, against Rawls's best advice, it will need to become more like the United States in the sense of strengthening its federal institutions and the EU-wide demos required to bring them about and make them work. This requires many initiatives and structural changes, essentially to strengthen the grip of pan-European deliberation relative to interstate bargaining. But one development is more fundamental than any other, and aptly identified by Margaret Thatcher, and here we are coming very close to the dessert of, at the end of this long lecture. Here is Thatcher's kind advice, suggestion. Perhaps the most significant shortcoming of the fledgling superstate, European Union, is that it is not, will not be, indeed ultimately cannot be democratic. The real reason why there can be no functioning pan-European democracy is because there exists no pan-European public opinion. It is commonplace, but it's all too frequently ignored, that the European Union nations are extraordinarily divided, deeply divided by language. No fewer than 12 main languages are widely spoken among the present members. Since then, the number of languages has further increased. Of course, in time, Europeans may all, in any case, speak English. She puts in brackets, I only half jest. If that happens, she said, it might be possible. If that happens, it might be possible to consider seriously trying to make democracy work at the pan-European level. And this takes us back to the linguistic issue, which I briefly touched upon in response to Rawls, when I alluded to the need to create a pan-European demos consistently with the vigorous protection of Europe's linguistic diversity. There cannot be a European demos without people being able to communicate cheaply and effectively with one another despite the diversity of their native languages. This requires the democratization of a common lingua franca. In the European Union, this lingua franca is and will remain English, a sort of sloppy mixture of German and French, that will operate as a more neutral common medium after Brexit. In this respect, too, the European Union must become more like the United States, having a language in which all people can communicate. But this democratization can and must be made consistent with respect for the diversity of native languages and their lasting preservation, thanks to the territorially circumscribed implementation of coercive rules regarding the use of languages in public communication and compulsory education. Won't develop any of this, but to show that it's not completely outlandish, let me just quote Bundespräsident for not much longer, Joachim Gauck, in a speech he gave in 2013, and which I thought was quite remarkable. He said it's true to say that young people are growing up with English as the lingua franca. However, I feel that we should not simply let things take their course when it comes to linguistic integration. For more Europe means multilingualism, not only for the elites, but also for ever larger sections of the population, for ever more people, ultimately for everyone. I'm convinced that feeling at home in one's native language, the German is particularly Beheimatung in der eigenen Muttersprache und in ihrer Poesie, that feeling at home in one's own native language and its magic, and being able to speak enough English to get by in all situations and at all ages can exist alongside each other in Europe. A common language would make it easier to realize my wish for Europe's future. And so, his Wunschbild für Europa is namely a European agora, a common forum for discussion to enable us to live together in a democratic order. This sort of message should give us hope. But this part of Gauck's message was not exactly received with universal approval in Germany, home to the first language of the European Union in terms of native speakers, even more, of course, after Brexit. It also leads to a set of hard questions, not only about how best to democratize competence in lingua franca, but also about how to prevent the European Public Forum from being colonized by the Anglo-American press, The Economist, the Financial Times, Politico, and the like. I leave these questions aside, as well as the many questions about what needs to be done beyond this linguistic dimension in order to strengthen the European demos and help it do what it needs to do for the sake of just Europe. I want to close, however, by returning to a more general and more fundamental condition for progress, and at times also simply for successful resistance against regression. And I shall do so by quoting more fully the last paragraph of Politik als Beruf. Here it is. Politics, he says, Weber, is a strong and slow boring of hard boards. It takes both passion and perspective, Leidenschaft und Augenmaß. Certainly, all historical experience confirms that the sentence I quoted earlier, the truth that man would not have attained the possible unless time and again he had reached out for the impossible. But to do that, a man must be a leader, and not only a leader, but a hero as well. Muss ein Führer und nicht nur das, sondern auch ein Held sein. And even those who are neither leaders nor heroes must arm themselves with that steadfastness of heart which can brave even the crumbling of all hopes. This is necessary right now, he said, 1919, or else men will not be able to attain even that which is possible today. Only he has the calling for politics who is sure that he shall not crumble when the world, from his point of view, is too stupid or too base for what he wants to offer. These are the women and the men Europe badly needs to conduct mit Leidenschaft und Augenmaß zugleich the frequently uphill struggle for a more just Europe. Their commitment and their persistence, their passion and their judgment are what will make possible one day what today is or just seems impossible. Thank you.